The axe hit the ground between Catherine Townsend's feet so hard that the iron blade buried itself 2 inches into the frozen dirt, and the whole logging camp went silent. Every man within 50 yards stopped moving. Steam hung from their mouths in the sharp November air of 1887. The Douglas firs stood tall and indifferent above them all, and the only sound was the distant groan of the Clearwater River pushing against its icy banks somewhere down the hillside in the Idaho Territory. Jeremiah Stone stood 10 feet away, his chest heaving, his enormous hands balled at his sides, his dark eyes burning with something that looked like fury but carried every bruise of a man who had been betrayed so completely that rage was the only language left to him. "Tell me it isn't true," he said. His voice was low. That was the most terrifying part. A man that size, with those shoulders, with that jaw set like a piece of quarried granite, should have been screaming. Instead, he was barely whispering, and every syllable landed like a stone dropped into still water. "Tell me you didn't come here with a hidden motive. Tell me you didn't know who I was before you ever set foot on this mountain." Catherine did not step back. That was the second most terrifying part, for him, not for herself. She was 24 years old, she stood 5 feet and 4 inches tall, her dark auburn hair was pinned under a wool cap, and she was looking directly into the eyes of the largest, most feared man in the entire Pacific Northwest logging industry without so much as flinching. "I did know who you were," she said. "And I'm not going to pretend otherwise." The silence that followed was the kind that precedes avalanches. Jeremiah pulled the axe from the ground in a single motion, the way another man might lift a pencil, and he turned his back on her and walked toward the tree line. Catherine watched him go. Her hands were trembling inside her coat pockets where no one could see them, and she pressed her lips together and told herself she would not cry. Not here. Not in front of these men who had already decided she didn't belong. Not in front of him. But she had not expected it to hurt this much. She had not expected any of it to go the way it had. When she'd ridden into the camp at the base of Elk Ridge 3 weeks ago, she had told herself this was business. A dark past needed burying, a secret needed uncovering, and Jeremiah Stone was the key to both. She had not planned to care about him. She had certainly not planned to fall in love with him. But the Wild West had a way of destroying every plan a person made, and apparently Jeremiah Stone was no different from the territory itself, vast, impossible, and capable of cracking open things inside a person that she hadn't known were sealed shut. It had started, as most things in that country did, with a letter. Catherine had been living in the small town of Lewiston, Idaho Territory, working as a bookkeeper for a dry goods merchant named Harold Fenn. She was good with numbers. She had always been good with numbers. Her father, a schoolteacher before the war, had taught her arithmetic the way other men taught their sons, without apology, and the skill had kept her alive through years that had not been kind. She had come to Lewiston from Missouri 2 years earlier, in 1885, after a series of events she rarely discussed and never revisited in polite conversation. She had a room above the dry goods store. She had a small savings in the Lewiston Bank, and she had a life that was quiet and controlled and hollow in a way she had learned to accept. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in October of 1887, addressed to Harold Fenn, but concerning a business matter that required the skills of anyone in his employ who could read a financial ledger. Harold, who was 62 years old and suffered terribly from his knees, had looked at Catherine across his cluttered desk and said, without ceremony, "You'll have to go up to the Stone camp on Elk Ridge and sort this out. Man's being robbed blind and doesn't know it yet." Jeremiah Stone owned the largest independent logging operation in all of Idaho Territory. He had built it from nothing over the course of 8 years, starting at the age of 22 with 1 team of horses, 1 crosscut saw, and a contract with a sawmill in Lewiston that barely covered his costs. By 1887 he was 30 years old, employed 63 men, held timber rights on 14,000 acres, and had a reputation that preceded him by several counties in every direction. He was, by every account, the strongest man anyone had ever personally witnessed. Not just physically, though the stories about that were extraordinary and occasionally disbelieved until witnessed firsthand, but in the way a man is strong when he has built everything he has with his own hands and has never once asked for help and has never once broken. There was something in him that did not bend. He was also, according to Harold Fenn and several other reliable sources, being systematically defrauded by his own camp foreman, a man named Walt Duggan, who had been skimming from the supply accounts and the payroll ledgers for the better part of 18 months. Harold had stumbled onto it through a series of supplier invoices that crossed his desk, and rather than go to the county sheriff in Lewiston, who was friendly with Duggan and might bury the matter, he had decided to send someone into the camp directly. He had decided to send Catherine. She had agreed for 2 reasons. The first was that Harold offered her a $20 bonus on top of her regular wages, which was real money. The second reason she kept to herself entirely, because it was the kind of reason that could get a person killed in the Idaho Territory in 1887. She had ridden the supply wagon up the mountain on a cold October morning, seated beside a teamster named Ezra who smelled of pine pitch and spoke very little. The road into the camp was a raw cut through old-growth timber, deep-rutted and steep, and by the time they crested the last switchback and she saw the camp laid out below her in a natural bowl between 2 ridgelines, she felt the first small drop of her composure begin to slip. It was enormous. She had not expected that. 63 men was an abstraction, but the physical reality of 63 men plus their horses plus their equipment plus their bunkhouses and cook shack, and the constant overlapping sounds of axes and saws and chains and falling trees. It was like a small town that had decided to wage war on a forest, and it was winning. The stumps went on for acres. The skid roads were packed mud glazed with frost. The smell of fresh-cut wood hung over everything like incense in a cathedral, sweet and sharp and tinged with sawdust. And then she saw Jeremiah Stone. He was not difficult to identify. He was standing in the middle of the main yard with his sleeves rolled to the elbow despite the cold, directing 2 teams of horses that were pulling a log the size of a small building out of the brush. He was giving instructions with his hands and his voice equally, calm and decisive, and the men around him moved with a kind of organized efficiency that spoke of deep trust and long habit. He was taller than anyone else in the yard by at least 3 inches. His shoulders were the width of an axle beam. His hair was black, cut short, and his jaw carried a week's dark growth of beard. He looked up when the supply wagon came into the yard and his eyes found Catherine before they found Ezra, and for a moment, just one moment, something moved across his face that she couldn't name. Then it was gone and he was looking at Ezra and calling out about the flour barrels that were already 3 days late. Catherine climbed down from the wagon without assistance and straightened her coat and walked directly toward him. "Mr. Stone," she said, "my name is Catherine Townsend. I'm Harold Fenn's bookkeeper. He's sent me to review your supply accounts. I'll need a workspace and access to your ledgers." He looked down at her from his considerable height with an expression that she would later describe in her private journal as profoundly unimpressed. "You're his bookkeeper," he said. "I am." "You're a woman." "That observation is accurate," she said. "It has no bearing on my ability to read a ledger." Something shifted in his expression. She did not think it was warmth exactly. It was more like the particular look a man gets when he encounters something unexpected in terrain he thought he knew completely. A new rock formation, a spring where there had been no spring, something that required reassessment. "Bunkhouse 3 is empty," he said. "You can use it. Duggan keeps the accounts in the foreman's office. He'll show you what you need." That was the problem, of course. Duggan would show her exactly what he wanted her to see, and nothing more. Catherine had already anticipated this. She thanked Jeremiah Stone with a nod and followed a young camp hand named Thomas to Bunkhouse 3, and while she was arranging her modest things on the narrow bunk, she was already planning how to get to the accounts that Duggan did not want anyone to see. Walt Duggan was a compact, sandy-haired man of 35 with pale blue eyes that were friendly on the surface, and cold 2 layers beneath. He had been foreman at Stone's camp for 2 years, and in that time had made himself indispensable in the way that people who are robbing you always do, by performing his visible duties with precision, while quietly dismantling your financial foundation in the dark. He greeted Catherine with easy courtesy and showed her the main ledger books with what appeared to be complete openness, and she smiled and took notes and said nothing that would indicate she had already spotted 3 separate places in the first hour where the numbers did not reconcile. She spent the first 3 days doing nothing remarkable. She reviewed the accounts she had been shown. She ate at the long tables in the cook shack with the men, who ranged in their response to her presence from openly curious to carefully polite to deeply uncomfortable. She walked the camp in the mornings before work began, ostensibly to familiarize herself with the operation, actually to map the location of every outbuilding and storage structure. She asked questions about the supply chain that sounded naive and were not, and she watched Jeremiah Stone. She had not intended to watch him in any way that wasn't strictly professional. But the camp was not large and he was not a man who could be overlooked, and over those first 3 days she began to understand something about him that the general reputation didn't capture. He was not simply big and strong and competent. He was the center of gravity for every person in that camp. Not through intimidation. She had seen the other kind of foreman, the kind who kept order through fear, and Jeremiah was nothing like that. He kept order through a quality that was harder to name. It was something like absolute reliability. When he said a thing would be done, it was done. When he made a decision, it was the right decision. When one of his men was hurt, a young logger named Pete Callahan took a rope burn across his palm on the second day. Jeremiah was the first one there and the last one to leave, and he sat with the boy for 20 minutes afterward just talking about nothing, just making sure the shock passed and the boy felt steady. He didn't make anything of it. He just did it. And every man in that camp saw it and filed it away in the same place where loyalty lives. She watched all of this and she thought, this is a man who has built something real. And then she thought, and someone is stealing it from him. And then, though she did not say it even to herself, she thought, that is not something I am willing to allow. On the 4th day, she found what she had actually come to find. She had waited until after midnight when the camp was quiet, and the only sounds were the distant screaming of a nighthawk and the pop of cooling wood in the stoves. She had taken a small lantern, turned it low, and gone to the supply shed that sat behind the foreman's office. Duggan kept a secondary set of records there. She had noticed during her tour that he'd hesitated slightly when she'd asked about the shed, then recovered smoothly and said it was just inventory storage. People who are hiding things always recover a half-second too slowly. The secondary records were in a locked box under a false bottom in a storage crate. The lock was a simple padlock of the kind that could be opened with a bent wire, which was a skill her years in Missouri had equipped her with. Inside the box were 18 months of parallel ledger books, handwritten in Duggan's tight, precise script, recording the actual transactions against which the official books could be compared. The difference was staggering. Over 18 months, Duggan had stolen from Jeremiah Stone a sum that Catherine calculated, sitting on the cold dirt floor of the supply shed with her lantern barely bright enough to read by, at somewhere between $2,000 and $2,500. In 1887 in Idaho Territory, that was a fortune. She photographed nothing because there were no cameras in the camp. She copied key figures into a small notebook she kept in her coat pocket. She replaced the ledger books exactly as she had found them, reset the lock, replaced the false bottom, and walked back to bunkhouse 3 in the dark with her heart hammering and her breath coming in short visible clouds and her mind running through the calculations of what had to happen next. She needed to tell Jeremiah. That much was clear. The question was how, and how quickly, and whether she had enough evidence yet to make the case airtight. She also needed to tell him the second thing, the thing she had kept from Harold Fenn, the reason she had agreed so readily to make this trip. The dark thing that had followed her from Missouri. the secret that was tangled up in Walt Duggan's name in a way that she had not yet fully unraveled. Because Catherine Townsend had not arrived in Lewiston, Idaho Territory by accident. She had arrived there following a name. The man who had destroyed her family's finances in Missouri, who had forged documents and stolen from her father's business partner, and left her father's name ruined and her father himself dead of what the doctor called heart failure, but what Catherine knew was despair. That man had used the name Edward Carr. She had spent 2 years searching for Edward Carr in the territory records and the county filings and the land office documents, and 3 months ago she had found a discrepancy in a name, a set of initials, a particular handwriting quirk in a supply contract filed through Harold Finn's office that matched, almost exactly, the handwriting of a letter her father had kept until his death. A letter signed by Edward Carr. Walt Duggan and Edward Carr were the same man. She was almost certain of it. She could not yet prove it, but she was close. This was the part she had not told Jeremiah Stone. This was the hidden motive that would, when it came out, and it would come out, she had always known it would become the axe buried between her feet. She spent another week gathering evidence, building the case layer by careful layer. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. But something was happening to her in those 2 weeks that she had not planned for, could not have planned for, and could not stop once it began. She was spending time with Jeremiah Stone. It started practically. He had begun stopping by the small table she'd set up in Bunkhouse 3 in the evenings, ostensibly to see how the review was progressing. Actually, she came to understand this later, because he was worried about what she might find. Not in the guilty way of someone hiding something, but in the way of a man who has worked for 8 years to build something and exists in constant low-level dread that the world will find a way to take it from him. He had that quality about him that she recognized from people who had suffered significant losses early in life, a vigilance that never quite rested, a watchfulness that was not paranoia but was not entirely peace either. The first real conversation happened on a Tuesday evening, 8 days after her arrival. She had been working by lamplight, and he had come in with 2 cups of coffee, actual coffee, which was a luxury in a logging camp and which told her something about him, and set one in front of her without ceremony, and she had looked up and said, "Thank you," and he had sat down across from her and said, "What do you actually think of the numbers you've been looking at?" She had looked at him for a long moment. She was not ready to reveal what she'd found. She said, "I think there are some discrepancies I need to trace further before I can give you a complete picture." He nodded slowly. "How bad?" "I don't know yet," she said. It was not entirely a lie. He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his enormous hands with a careful, precise movement that struck her as somehow out of character with everything else about him. But then, she was learning that the character she'd assembled for him from reputation and observation was considerably more complicated than any version of it she'd imagined in advance. "I started this operation with $300, he said. "My father's money. He died when I was 21, worked in a mill in Oregon for 30 years and saved $300. He paused. I promised him I'd do something with it." She did not say anything. She recognized the quality of what he was telling her. It was not complaint. It was not sentiment. It was simply the facts of a man's life offered as context. The way people sometimes offer context when they're trying to explain why something matters. "You did something with it," she said finally. "I did," he agreed. And there was no pride in it, just acknowledgement of a fact, and she found that more moving than any amount of boasting would have been. She wanted badly to tell him then, but she didn't. Over the next several days, the conversations became longer. He began appearing at the cook shack at the same time she did in the evenings, and they fell into the habit of sitting at the end of the long table after the other men had cleared out, talking about the operation, about the timber, about Lewiston and the territory, and the way the country was changing with the railroads pushing deeper into the mountains every year. He was not, she discovered, a naturally talkative man. He had the quality of stillness that belonged to people who were comfortable with silence, in a way that city-raised people rarely understood. But when he did speak, he spoke precisely, and he listened the way very few people listened, with his full attention, as though what you were saying was the only thing happening in the world. She was not prepared for how much that affected her. He had a way of looking at her when she said something that struck him, not challenging, not admiring exactly, but something more genuine than either. The look of a man encountering something he hadn't expected and choosing to sit with it rather than categorize it immediately. She had never had anyone look at her quite that way before. She had had men look at her with desire, which was its own thing, and men look at her with patronization, which was a different thing entirely, and men look at her with respect, which was rarer and therefore more valuable. But Jeremiah Stone looked at her with something that felt like recognition, as though she were a thing he had been looking for in the landscape for a long time without knowing the name of it. She told herself she was imagining this. She had a habit, when the truth was inconvenient, of telling herself she was imagining it. She had gotten quite good at this over the years. On the 11th day, Pete Callahan, the young logger who had burned his hand on the rope, came to her table in the evening with his hat in his hand and said that one of the other loggers, a man named Hooper, was arguing that the camp cook had been shortchanging them on their wages by 2 cents on the dollar for the past month and a half, and would she look at it? She said she would. It turned out to be a genuine accounting error rather than theft. The cook, a gruff and efficient Finnish man named Alvar, had been using an old pay scale by mistake, and Catherine corrected it and explained the correction to both Hooper and Alvar without embarrassing either of them, and the matter was resolved in 20 minutes. That evening, Jeremiah found her at the cook shack table and said simply, "Thank you for handling that." "It was a straightforward correction," she said. "The way you handled it wasn't straightforward. You could have made Alvar look like a thief and Hooper look like a troublemaker. You didn't do either." She looked at him. "Why would I make them look like things they aren't?" He was quiet for a moment. "Most people who have something to prove tend to use the opportunities they get," he said. "You didn't." "I'm not here to prove anything," she said. "I know," he said. And then, in a voice that was quieter than his usual register, he said, "That's the first time anyone has said that to me in this camp in 3 years and meant it." She did not fully understand what he meant by that until later, much later. The intimacy between them deepened in the way that intimacy deepens between people who are alone together in the mountains in late autumn, slowly at first, then all at once, the way the temperature drops between afternoon and nightfall. It was built of small things. The way he held a door open for her, and she thanked him without the performance that women sometimes used to make men feel important for courtesy. The way she occasionally asked him a question about the timber or the equipment and listened to the answer with genuine interest, because she was genuinely interested. The way he had taken to waiting for her at the edge of the yard on her morning walks and falling into step beside her without asking permission and without requiring conversation, just present, just there, the way a mountain is there. On the 14th day, something shifted more significantly. She had been working late and had gone to the supply shed for reasons she told herself were professional. She needed to check a figure in the secondary ledger, and she had found the lock already open. She stood in the dark outside the shed with her hand on the latch and understood, with a cold certainty that moved through her like ice water, that someone else had been there. Recently. The disturbed dust at the threshold was still soft. She was standing there, frozen, working out what this meant when she heard Duggan's voice behind her. "Funny time to be checking inventory," he said. She turned. He was standing 5 feet away in the dark, and the friendliness was gone from his pale blue eyes with a thoroughness that was frightening. There was no transition zone between the mask and what was underneath. It was simply gone, and what was there instead was the cold thing that had always been there, fully visible now, looking at her with the calculating patience of a man who had done this before and was not particularly worried about having to do it again. "I was looking for the purchase records for the October harness order," she said. Her voice did not shake. She was proud of that. "The October harness order is in the main ledger," Duggan said, "which is in my office." "Of course," she said. "I must have misremembered where you said it was stored." He smiled. The smile was the worst part. "Easy to get confused," he said. "There's a lot of paperwork in a big operation like this." He paused. "You're doing a real thorough job, Miss Townsend. Real thorough. Mr. Stone is lucky to have such a diligent bookkeeper looking after his interests." Another pause, longer, waited. "It'd be a shame if something were to happen that made it necessary for you to leave the camp before you finished your review." She looked at him steadily. "I plan to finish what I started," she said. She went back to bunkhouse 3 and sat on her bunk in the dark for a long time, thinking very carefully. Duggan knew she'd found something, or suspected she had. She had perhaps 3 days before he acted, which meant she needed to get the evidence to Jeremiah, and she needed to get it to him in a form that he could verify without warning Duggan. She needed to do this carefully and quickly, and she needed to do it without telling Jeremiah the second part yet, the part about Edward Carr, the part about Missouri, the part that would make everything complicated. She spent the next day making careful copies of the most damning figures from the secondary ledger, working from memory, building a comparison document that showed the official books against what the hidden records actually said. By that evening she had what she needed. She asked to speak with Jeremiah privately. He came to bunkhouse 3, and she laid the documents on the table and she explained, clearly and without embellishment, what she had found. She explained the discrepancy in the supply accounts, the false invoices, the systematic skimming of the payroll. She showed him the figures. She showed him how the pattern had been constructed, how Duggan had used multiple overlapping methods to make individual transactions small enough to pass cursory review. She showed him the total. She watched him read. She watched his jaw set. She watched his hands on the table, utterly still, which was the most alarming thing. A man of that physical power, holding himself that completely motionless, was expending an extraordinary effort. He read everything twice. He did not speak while he read. When he finished, he sat back and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. $2,300, he said. "That is my estimate. The actual figure may be slightly higher." 8 years, he said, not to her, to himself. She waited. He looked at her then, and his eyes were doing the thing she had come to recognize, working through something, processing, deciding. "How did you find the secondary records?" he asked. She told him. She told him about the supply shed and the false bottom crate, leaving out the part about the late-night expedition and the bent wire. She told him she had noticed Duggan hesitate during the tour. "That was sharp work," he said. "It's what I'm here for," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer. Something in his expression was different from anything she had seen there before. It was unguarded in a way that all his other expressions weren't, and she understood that she was seeing the actual person beneath the competent, controlled exterior, the man who had made his father a promise and had spent 8 years keeping it, who was now sitting with the knowledge that someone he had trusted had been steadily destroying his life's work from the inside. "I'll confront Duggan tonight," he said, and began to stand. "Wait," she said. He looked at her. She should have told him then. About the second thing. About Missouri. About Edward Carr. She knew she should have. She could feel the weight of the undisclosed information pressing against the underside of every word she said. But she told herself she needed one more day to verify the handwriting comparison she'd been building. She told herself she was protecting the quality of the evidence. She told herself she would tell him tomorrow when she had everything complete. She told herself a great many things that were almost but not quite true. "Wait until tomorrow," she said instead. "If you confront him tonight, he'll destroy the secondary records before you can retrieve them. Let me go back to the shed tonight and remove the secondary ledger books. Once you have those in hand, the case is airtight." He thought about this. "He threatened you," he said. It was not a question. She hesitated a half-second too long. "He suggested I might want to leave before I finished my review." Jeremiah Stone's expression did something then that she had never seen it do before and that she would remember for the rest of her life. It went completely still. Not the controlled stillness of a man managing anger, but something deeper and more absolute, the stillness of a mountain in the second before a rockslide begins. He looked at her with an intensity that had nothing to do with the accounts and everything to do with the fact that she had been threatened and he had not known, and she was in his camp and therefore, by some code of his that went deeper than law or policy, under his protection. "He won't touch you," he said. "I'm aware of that," she said. "I am handling it." "I know you are," he said, and then softer, "That's not the point." She looked at him across the table in the lamplight and understood, with a clarity that hit her somewhere behind the sternum, that she was in serious trouble. Not from Duggan. From the man sitting across from her, looking at her like that. She got the secondary ledger books that night. She was careful and quick, and she replaced the box exactly as she had found it, and she returned to bunkhouse 3 with the evidence tucked inside her coat, her heart beating too fast. She sat with the books and her comparison documents and her separate notebook, and she worked until nearly 4 in the morning finishing her written analysis. And at the very end she took out the old letter she had carried from Missouri in the lining of her travel bag, her father's letter, signed by Edward Carr with its distinctive upward hook on the letter G and its tight, leftward slant, and she compared it to the handwriting in Walt Duggan's secondary ledger. She compared it for a long time. It was the same hand. She was certain. She should have slept. She didn't. She sat with the confirmed knowledge and the unresolved question of what to do with it, and she thought about her father. And she thought about the promise she had made at his grave. And she thought about Jeremiah Stone's eyes in the lamplight. And she understood that the two things she needed to do: expose Duggan as a thief and expose him as the man who had ruined her family, were about to collide in a way that she could not control, because she had not told Jeremiah about the second one. And when he found out, he would see it as betrayal. He would see it as her having come to his camp with a hidden motive. He would see it as the trap she had set, even if the trap had never been aimed at him. She went to him in the morning before the day's work began, and she laid out the full evidence, the ledger books, the comparison documents, the case for Duggan's removal and prosecution. She had rehearsed what she would say about Missouri. She had the words prepared. She opened her mouth to say them, and Jeremiah said, "Let's deal with Duggan first." And she thought, "Yes, that's right, deal with Duggan first." And she told herself she would tell him everything after. The confrontation with Duggan happened in the main yard at midday, with the full camp as witness, because Jeremiah had judged correctly that a man like Duggan needed to be seen by everyone when he fell. It was not violent. Jeremiah held the secondary ledger books in his hand and set them on the upended log that served as a work table and said, simply and clearly, "These are your real records. These end your employment here, and they begin a conversation with the county sheriff about restitution." He paused. "I gave you a job when you needed one and trusted you with this operation for 2 years. I've been fair to every man in this camp. What you did was not a business dispute. It was a betrayal. You stole from every man here because what you took from me was money I would have put back into their wages and their safety equipment." Duggan looked at the books and then looked around at the assembled men and understood that the mask was gone and everything was over. He had one more move and he played it. He looked at Catherine. "Ask her why she really came up here," he said. "Ask her what she was looking for before she found my ledgers. Ask her about Missouri." The silence that followed was the kind that changed the temperature of the air. Every head turned toward Catherine. She looked at Duggan and she felt the cold certainty of a person watching the inevitable arrive on schedule. She had known this moment would come. She had simply run out of time to get ahead of it. She looked at Jeremiah. His eyes were on her. That profound attention, that full presence that had undone her at the cook shack table over 2 weeks of quiet evenings, it was on her now, but it had a different quality. Not accusation yet, but the beginning of a question that was going to require a complete answer. "It's more complicated than he's making it sound," she said. "Then explain it," Jeremiah said. "Not here," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned back to Duggan. Collins Patterson, take him to the tack shed and lock it. I'll send for the sheriff." He paused. "We're not done here, Miss Townsend." For the next hour she had waited in bunkhouse 3 with a patience that was costing her considerably more than she let show. When Jeremiah came, he was still wearing the expression of a man who had not yet decided what he was dealing with, which was somehow harder to bear than open anger would have been. She told him everything. She told him about her father's business partner in Missouri, about the fraud, about the ruined finances and the forged documents, about her father's decline and death. She told him about the 2 years of searching in Lewiston and the handwriting comparison and the name Edward Carr. She told him that she had come to the camp primarily to investigate Duggan on Harold Fenn's behalf, but that she had also had her own reasons, her own investigation, her own history that had brought her to this particular mountain. She told him that she had found what she needed to find, and that Duggan was the man who had destroyed her family, and that she had not told him this because she had not fully verified it until the night before. She told him all of it steadily, looking at him directly, because she had made herself a promise at her father's grave and she was done with half-truths, regardless of the cost. When she finished, Jeremiah was quiet for a very long time. Then he stood and he walked to the door and he stopped and picked up the axe that was leaning against the wall by the entrance, and he walked outside. She followed him because she would not remain behind. And then the axe came down between her feet and the camp went silent and they were back at the beginning, standing 10 feet apart in the main yard, and he told her to tell him it wasn't true. She told him it was, and he walked into the tree line. She stood in the yard with 62 men looking at her, and she lifted her chin and walked back to bunkhouse 3, and she sat on her bunk, and she breathed carefully and deliberately, in and out for a long time. She was not going to run. She had run once before from Missouri, and it had bought her nothing except 2 years of hollow safety and a loneliness that had settled into her bones. She was not going to run again. The afternoon passed. Evening came. She ate alone at the far end of the cook's shack, and the men gave her space, not unkindly, with the intuition of people who had spent years reading weather and understanding when to stand clear. Pete Callahan brought her coffee without being asked and set it down without a word, and she thought that even here, at the worst of it, there was kindness to be found in unexpected places. Jeremiah did not come to the cook's shack. She went back to bunkhouse 3 and began, methodically, to pack her things. Not because she had decided to leave, she had not decided anything, but because she needed to do something with her hands. She folded her spare dress and her winter underthings and her extra stockings. She wrapped the secondary ledger books in her oil cloth, because they were evidence and they were going to the sheriff, whether Jeremiah Stone ever looked at her again or not. She packed her notebooks and her writing materials. She sat on the end of the bunk with her travel bag in front of her and waited. He came at full dark. She heard his footstep on the step before the knock because she had learned the particular sound of the way he walked, the weight of him, the deliberateness, each foot placed with intention. He knocked twice and she said, "Come in." He filled the doorway. He always filled the doorway. He had been out in the trees for hours. She could see it on him, the cold in his skin, the wood chips in his hair, the fresh marks on his hands where he had been working without gloves. When a man like Jeremiah Stone was in emotional distress, he did not drink and he did not fight. He worked. She understood this about him by now. He looked at the packed bag. "You're leaving," he said. "I hadn't decided," she said. "I was packing to keep myself occupied." He came in and sat on the bench across from her bunk, which was the only piece of furniture other than the small table. He rested his forearms on his knees and looked at the floor for a moment. When he looked up, his expression had done something she hadn't seen before. It had surrendered something. The control was still there, but there was something underneath it now, visible, alive, complicated. "I need to understand something," he said. "Not about the evidence and not about Duggan, about you." "Ask," she said. "When you were sitting at that table every evening and we were talking," he said. "When I told you about my father and the $300, when you walked with me in the mornings, When you asked me about the timber and listened to the answer, he paused. Was any of that real? The question was the most exposed she had ever seen him be. It cost him something significant to ask it. She could see exactly what it cost him. This was a man who did not ask for things, who had never had the luxury of asking for things, who had built his entire life on the understanding that you made yourself unassailable so that no one could reach you in a way that could damage you. And here he was, asking. All of it was real, she said. Every word of it. He looked at her. I should have told you about Missouri, she said. I told myself I was protecting the quality of the evidence. I was actually protecting myself from this conversation. That was a cowardice, and I'm sorry for it. He was quiet for a moment. You're not a coward, he said. I am about certain things. He looked at his hands. I'm not angry about Missouri, he said. I'm angry because he started again. You came here and things changed. The way the evenings went, the way the camp felt. Things I'd stopped expecting to feel started feeling like they might be possible. He paused again. And then it turned out you had a reason to be here that had nothing to do with me, and I felt like a fool. You're not a fool, she said. I felt like one. Jeremiah. She said his name for the first time, and he looked up at the sound of it. I came to this camp with a task and a hidden reason. Both of those things are true, but I did not come here expecting to find you. And I did not plan. Her voice did something she hadn't given it permission to do, a slight unevenness that she cleared away with a breath. I did not plan any of the things that happened between us. I did not plan any of how I feel. If I had planned it, I would have done it differently. I would have told you everything at the start, or I would have kept everything at a complete distance. I did neither, because the truth is that I couldn't. The silence in the small room was different from the silence in the yard. This silence had warmth in it. How do you feel? He said. She looked at him steadily. Like I have been sitting in a dark room for 2 years and someone opened a window, she said. And I am terrified of what that means because the last time I trusted that feeling I lost everything. He was very still. I'm not going to take anything from you, he said. I know that, she said. That's what makes it terrifying. Something moved through his face, not the controlled professional expression, and not the anger from the yard, and not even the unguarded look from the lamplight evenings. Something newer. Something that looked like the particular relief of a man who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time, and has finally been given permission to set it down. He reached across the space between them and took her hand in both of his, careful, as though she were something that could break. Which was not accurate. She was not a thing that broke easily, but she understood what the gentleness meant coming from a man of his strength, understood that he was showing her exactly what he thought of her, and he held it and looked at her and said nothing, because nothing was required. She turned her hand over in his and held back. The legal proceedings against Walt Duggan, whose real name was confirmed by the county sheriff as Edward Carr by way of a Missouri warrant that had been outstanding for 3 years, took most of the winter. Catherine remained at the camp through November at Jeremiah's request, completing a thorough reconstruction of the accounts. She sent the full documentation to the Nez Perce County Sheriff's Office in Lewiston, along with the Missouri connection, and a deputy came up the mountain in late November to take custody of Duggan and the secondary ledger books. He was transported to Lewiston and held for trial, and the subsequent legal case, while not swift, nothing in 1887 was swift, resulted in conviction the following spring and an order of restitution that, combined with Duggan's own assets, eventually returned roughly $1,400 to Jeremiah's operation. It was not the full $2,300, but it was more than most men recovered from situations of that kind in that era. Catherine had planned to return to Lewiston when the deputy took Duggan. She had packed her bag again, this time actually intending to use it. She had said goodbye to Pete Callahan, who shook her hand with the gravity of a young man performing a significant ceremony. She had said goodbye to Alvar the cook, who presented her with a jar of lingonberry preserves from his private stores, which was the highest compliment he knew how to pay. She had begun to say goodbye to Jeremiah. He had listened to her describe her return to Lewiston with an expression that she had learned by now to read with some precision, and that expression said very clearly, "I have a thing to say about this and I am working out how to say it." She had given him time. "I'd like you to stay," he said. She looked at him. "In what capacity?" It was a direct question and she did not apologize for it. She was done with imprecision. He looked at her with the steadiness that was perhaps the most fundamental thing about him. "In whatever capacity you're willing to accept," he said. "To start." It was not a grand declaration. It was not poetry. It was, she thought, exactly right. "I'll stay through the winter," she said. "And then we'll see." He nodded. Something in him settled, not relief exactly, something more durable than relief, like a foundation stone being set correctly. She unpacked her bag for the third time and put her spare dress back on the hook and sat down at her table and began reviewing the recalculated supply budget for the winter. And outside the window, the first serious snow of the season began to fall on Elk Ridge. The winter of 1887 to 1888 in the Idaho Territory was hard by anyone's measure. The Clearwater River froze solid by mid-December, which hadn't happened in 4 years. The snow on the ridge reached 6 feet in the deepest drifts. Supply wagons from Lewiston stopped running in January, which meant the camp was effectively isolated for 8 weeks, living on what they had stocked and what they could hunt, which was considerable on both counts because Jeremiah planned ahead with the thoroughness of a man who had been caught unprepared once and had decided it would never happen again. The isolation did something to the camp. It always did. In Catherine's experience, winter in close quarters with limited movement and reduced external stimulus pushed people either apart or together. And in this camp, under Jeremiah's management, it pushed them together. The evenings grew longer and more social. Alvar produced astonishing meals from limited ingredients. Pete Callahan turned out to own a fiddle and to play it with competent enthusiasm. And on Friday evenings, the cook shack became something approximating a gathering hall, with men playing cards and arguing good-naturedly about subjects ranging from the best way to fell a Douglas fir to the probable intentions of the railroad companies, with respect to the remaining timber rights in the territory. Catherine participated in all of it. She was not the kind of person who stood at the edge of things and watched. She had stood at the edge of things for 2 years in Lewiston, and she was done with it. She played cards with a ferocity that delighted the men and beat them frequently enough to maintain genuine credibility while losing occasionally enough to keep them coming back. She listened to Pete Callahan's fiddle, and she talked with the men about the things they wanted to talk about. And she was, slowly, accepted not in the resigned way of people tolerating an anomaly, but in the straightforward way of a community that has decided a person belongs. Through all of it, she and Jeremiah continued their private conversations. They evolved. The evenings at the cook shack table became long, rambling discussions about everything. About the future of the territory, about statehood, which Idaho achieved in 1890, and which both of them followed with keen interest. About the treatment of the Nez Perce people, whose ancestral lands these mountains had been. A subject that Jeremiah addressed with a directness that surprised her, until she learned that the man who had taught him to read timber patterns and navigate mountain terrain had been a Nez Perce elder named Joseph Running Elk, who had worked for the operation in its first 2 years, and who Jeremiah spoke of with the particular combination of respect and grief of someone who had lost a teacher and friend to the consequences of policies he found both unjust and unforgivable. Catherine listened to all of this with the full attention she had learned from him, and she felt, every time, that she was receiving something rare, the actual interior of a person who had no reason to perform and no interest in doing so. He began, in those winter months, to show her other things. He took her out on snowshoes one January morning before dawn to see the way the ridge looked at first light, the particular quality of pale blue that the snow took on in the deep cold before the sun came up, the absolute silence of the forest under heavy snowfall, the distant line of mountains to the east catching the first edge of dawn. She stood next to him on a promontory above the camp and looked at the world laid out below them, white and enormous and still, and she thought, this is what it means to be alive in a place instead of merely occupying it. She had not felt that since before her father died. She turned and looked at him. He was already looking at her. "Thank you for showing me this," she said. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair that the wind had pulled loose back under her wool cap, a gesture of such simple, unhurried intimacy that she felt it resonate through her entire chest, and he said, "I've wanted to show someone this for years." She kissed him first. It felt important that she make that choice herself, take that step herself, not wait to be taken toward something but move toward it. He was very still when she kissed him, as he was very still when he was receiving something significant, and then he was not still at all, and his arms came around her and lifted her slightly, not effortfully, with the same natural ease with which he moved enormous logs, and held her against him in the cold morning air with the mountains behind them and the camp below them, and she thought, this is where the wandering ends. They were formally engaged by February. Jeremiah asked her in the cook shack on a Sunday evening after supper, which she had expected, and he produced a ring that he had clearly acquired through some creative combination of his own materials and the services of the camp's sole craftsman, a French-Canadian man named Beaumont who had worked tin with considerable skill, and it fit almost perfectly, and she said yes before he had finished the sentence. The men cheered. Pete Callahan played 3 songs in a row on the fiddle, progressively louder. Alvar produced a bottle of aquavit that he had apparently been hoarding since September. It was the best evening Catherine had experienced in more years than she could name. The spring brought the thaw and the resumption of supply wagons from Lewiston, and eventually the news of Duggan's conviction, which arrived in a letter from the county sheriff's office in late April. The restitution order was confirmed, and the first payment arrived in May. Jeremiah read the letter twice in the manner of someone confirming that a thing has actually happened before allowing himself to fully believe it, and then he folded it very precisely and put it in his coat pocket and went back to work. That evening, Catherine found him sitting on the chopping block at the edge of the yard in the long spring twilight, looking at the tree line. She sat beside him. He reached over without looking and took her hand. "It's done," he said. "It is," she agreed. "I keep thinking about my father," he said. "What he would say." What would he say? Jeremiah thought for a moment. He would say the $300 was well spent, he said. And then he smiled, the full, unguarded smile that she had waited weeks to see and that, when it had first appeared, had rearranged something fundamental in her understanding of what she had gotten herself into. They were married in June of 1888. The ceremony was held in Lewiston, at the small church on 3rd Street, because Catherine had no family to travel and Jeremiah had no family remaining, and they both agreed that what was required was not a large audience, but a complete one, by which they meant people who were present because they genuinely wished them well. Harold Fenn came and gave Catherine away with the solemnity of a man who had not fully understood what he was setting in motion when he sent her up that mountain the previous October, and was enormously pleased with himself about it. Pete Callahan played the fiddle. Alvar made a cake from ingredients he had been accumulating secretively for a month. The French-Canadian Beaumont produced a gift of 2 matched tin cups engraved with their initials that they used for coffee for the next 30 years. They returned to Elk Ridge after 3 days in Lewiston, which was all the time the operation could spare, and all the time either of them genuinely required. Catherine had been offered a permanent role managing the camp's accounts, which she accepted not as a convenience, but because she was genuinely good at it, and because the work of building something together with a person you loved turned out to feel fundamentally different from any other kind of work she had done. She expanded the role over the following year to include supply contracts and vendor negotiations, which freed Jeremiah to focus on the operational side of the business, and the combination of their respective skills produced, over the next 3 years, the most efficient and financially sound period the operation had ever experienced. The trees continued to fall. The skid roads were extended deeper into the timber. New contracts were signed with 2 additional sawmills as the territory pushed toward statehood and the demand for lumber accelerated. Jeremiah hired 12 more men in 1889 and built a second bunkhouse and an expanded cook shack. Catherine negotiated a supply contract with a new regional vendor that saved the operation $400 annually in materials costs, which Jeremiah reinvested, characteristically, in equipment and wages. In the autumn of 1889, Idaho became a state. Jeremiah and Catherine sat on the steps of the main office, a proper office now, with a wooden floor and a real stove, and read the official notice together by lamplight. Jeremiah said, "My father would have liked to see this." Catherine said, "Tell me about him." And Jeremiah talked about his father for 2 hours, more than he had ever talked about him, the stories coming out in the unhurried way of things that have been kept safe until the right moment arrives. And Catherine listened to all of it and held his hand, and understood that this was the kind of intimacy that no particular romantic gesture could produce or replace. The intimacy of being the person someone tells the real things to. Their first child was born in May of 1890, a boy. They named him William, after Jeremiah's father, and the name felt right in the way that things feel right when they're not a compromise but an agreement. William Stone arrived into the world at Elk Ridge, delivered by the midwife from the town of Orofino, who had come up the mountain 2 weeks early to be certain she was there in time. And when Jeremiah held his son for the first time, he looked at Catherine over the boy's head with an expression that she had no word for in any language she knew, and she said nothing because nothing was required. Pete Callahan played the fiddle in the yard. Alvar made cake. Beaumont engraved the boy's initials on a small tin disc that served as an identification tag for his cradle. The camp celebrated with the particular warmth of a community that has been built on genuine mutual care and knows it. William grew. He was, from very early on, a person of determined opinions and considerable physical energy, which surprised no one. He learned to walk in the camp yard and immediately showed a preference for the direction of the horse barn, which had to be redirected frequently and with some effort. By the age of 2, he was following his father on the morning rounds of the operation, with the focused attention of someone taking notes. And the men of the camp found this so completely charming that it became a general practice to explain things to William in meticulous detail, whether or not he showed signs of comprehension. In the spring of 1892, Catherine found herself in the familiar state of anticipation that William's arrival had first introduced, and she told Jeremiah one evening over coffee with the straightforward efficiency that characterized most of her important communications. He set his cup down. He looked at her. He said, "How are you feeling?" before anything else, which was, she thought, the most Jeremiah Stone response possible and exactly right. Their second child, a girl they named Eleanor, arrived in October of 1892 in a shorter and more eventful process than William's birth, attended again by the Orofino midwife, and by Jeremiah himself, who remained in the room against the midwife's mild protest and held Catherine's hand through all of it without flinching or being in the way, because he was a man who understood that being present when someone you love was in difficulty was not optional regardless of personal discomfort. Eleanor Stone arrived with a quantity of dark hair and an immediate and specific opinion about being put down, which she communicated at considerable volume, and which turned out to be a consistent feature of her character going forward. The camp had grown substantially by 1892. The operation now employed 91 men across 2 work sites on Elk Ridge, with a third site under evaluation for the following year. There was a school of sorts, a one-room building that Catherine had proposed and organized, and that 3 of the camp workers' families used, serviced by a teacher from Orofino who came up the mountain twice a week. There was a proper infirmary, because Catherine had pushed for one after Pete Callahan's rope burn, and a subsequent incident involving a badly reset fracture that had cost a man the use of 2 fingers. There was a reading room, small but well-stocked, because both Jeremiah and Catherine considered literacy a practical necessity, and because the isolation of winter camps could be mitigated by books in ways that were not sufficiently appreciated by people who hadn't experienced it. Pete Callahan was, by 1892, the assistant foreman. He had grown from the nervous young logger with the burned hand into a competent, steady man of 26 who handled men and timber with equal skill, and who treated Jeremiah and Catherine with a particular combination of professional respect and personal affection that made him something between an employee and a younger sibling. He was still single, a fact that his mother, who visited the camp once a year from Lewiston, commented on with energetic optimism. He still played the fiddle on Friday evenings. The restitution from Duggan's conviction was finally completed in the fall of 1892, the last payment arriving in a bank draft from the county that Jeremiah endorsed and deposited with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything. The full case had concluded. The final thread of the trap that Duggan had set, the dark past that had followed Catherine from Missouri, was now fully closed. She had written a letter to her father's grave, which was something she did occasionally when things were resolved that had been promised, and she had told him about the conviction and the restitution and William and Alina and the mountains and Jeremiah, and she had thanked him for teaching her arithmetic and for the letters he'd kept that had given her the handwriting evidence she'd needed. And she had said goodbye to the part of her life that had been defined by grief and searching, and had turned fully toward the part that was defined by what she'd built. In the evenings of that autumn of 1892, after the children were asleep and the camp had settled into its nighttime sounds, Catherine and Jeremiah sat on the steps of their small house. Jeremiah had built it himself the previous winter on the eastern edge of the camp, 2 rooms and a loft, solid enough to survive anything the territory could produce, and they talked the way they had always talked, about everything and nothing, about the business and the future and the children and the country. The trees were changing color on the lower slopes. The air had the particular sharpness that preceded the first autumn cold snap. The valley below was beginning to show its nighttime lights, the small towns that had grown up along the river as the territory settled into statehood. "Tell me something," Catherine said. "What do you want to know?" She considered. "Tell me what you thought the first time you saw me." He was quiet for a moment, which meant he was actually thinking about it rather than producing a quick answer. "I thought you were going to be trouble," he said. She laughed. It was a real laugh, unguarded, the kind she had rarely produced in the years before Elk Ridge. "That's very honest." "You asked for honest," he said. "What kind of trouble?" He looked at her. The lamplight from inside the house was falling across his face and doing things with the shadows that she found interesting. "The kind that changes everything," he said. "I didn't know what kind exactly. I just knew that when you looked at me like you weren't impressed and walked across the yard like you owned it, something changed. I didn't know yet what it was." "And now you know," she said. "Now I know," he said. She leaned against him. He put his arm around her and held her with the natural ease of someone for whom this was the default position, the resting state, and she felt the solidity of him and thought, as she still sometimes thought, about the woman she had been on that supply wagon coming up the mountain in October of 1887, compact and controlled and hollow, certain she was managing everything, carrying a secret in her lining and a grief she had refused to name. That woman had not known what was waiting on the mountain. She had not known about the enormous man with the black hair and the stillness, who looked at her like a new feature in familiar terrain and made space for her at his table and showed her the ridge at dawn and held her hand in the cold and asked, with everything at stake, whether any of it had been real. It had all been real. It had become more real every day since. From across the yard, a light was still burning in the bunkhouses. The river made its sounds in the dark below. The mountains stood in their long indifference to human events, enormous and permanent and unchanged by the small dramas of the people who moved among them. Jeremiah tightened his arm around her. "What are you thinking?" He said. "That I'm glad I got on that supply wagon," she said. He pressed his lips to the top of her head. "So am I," he said. "Every day." In the years that followed, and there were many of them, full and various and built on the foundation they had laid on that mountain, Jeremiah Stone remained the strongest man in the operation by the account of every man who worked for him. His physical strength did not diminish with time. He was still at 40, capable of demonstrations that caused new workers to stop what they were doing and stare. But the men who had been with him since the beginning, the ones like Pete Callahan, who had watched the whole story from the supply wagon onward, knew that the real strength was the other kind. The kind that had been there when he held his son for the first time, and when he sat with young loggers through their shocks and their fears and their difficulties. The kind that had made him confront Duggan in the open yard rather than in a back room. The kind that had walked out to the tree line when he was hurt and come back in the dark and asked the question that cost him something to ask. Catherine managed the business. She expanded into supply consulting for 2 neighboring operations in 1894, earning independent income and a reputation in the regional timber industry as the most precise accountant west of the Continental Divide. She continued to read voraciously and to run the camp reading room, which by 1895 had a collection of over 300 volumes. She taught her children arithmetic with the same unsentimental thoroughness with which her father had taught her, because skills were the most durable inheritance. She argued with Jeremiah regularly about business decisions and was right approximately as often as he was, which they both considered ideal. She walked with him in the morning still, when the camp was quiet and the light was coming up over the eastern ridge and the world had not yet started its noise. And they talked or they were silent with equal ease, because after enough years with the right person, both become the same kind of comfortable. In 1895, their 3rd child arrived, another boy named James Thomas Stone, Thomas for no particular reason except that they both liked it, who entered the world in a remarkably straightforward manner, and immediately demonstrated a preference for quiet observation over active participation that made him seem, from his earliest weeks, already slightly older than he was. James grew up reading at an age that impressed the camp's schoolteacher and occasionally startled visitors who were expecting, given his parents, something more physically demonstrative. Eleanor, by contrast, had inherited her father's physical nature and her mother's precision in equal measure, which produced a child who could climb anything in the camp by the age of 4, and could also accurately estimate its height and calculate the safest descent route before beginning. She terrified the camp workers in the most affectionate possible way, and adored her father with a devotion that was mutual and complete. William, the eldest, had by the time of James's arrival begun accompanying his father on actual work rounds rather than just observation rounds, learning the timber trade with the seriousness of someone who has decided on their life's occupation. Jeremiah taught him without pressure and without assumption, making clear that the operation was his to take on if he chose it, and not his obligation if he didn't, and that either was acceptable. William thought about this for a number of years in the way of thoughtful young people who take seriously the weight of a choice they haven't yet made, and eventually chose the timber as Jeremiah had always slightly suspected he would, because it was in him the way the mountains were in the men who grew up near them. The 1890s were a decade of change in Idaho. The railroad pushed further into the mountains. New towns appeared along the river valleys. The timber industry consolidated, with large eastern companies beginning to acquire the independent operations that couldn't compete at scale. Jeremiah received acquisition offers in 1894 and 1896 and declined both, not from sentiment but from calculation. The operation was profitable enough at its current scale. The men who worked it were owed the stability of continued ownership, and the land, managed correctly, would support timber operations for generations. He was managing for the long run in a way that the acquisition-minded Eastern companies were not, and he knew it. Catherine supported both refusals with analysis that made the case more airtight than his instincts alone could have. She had run the numbers across 3 different projection models, each of them showing that the long-term value of the standing timber rights exceeded the offered acquisition price by a significant margin. The Eastern companies were buying the present. Jeremiah and Catherine were building the future. Pete Callahan, who became full foreman in 1895, when Jeremiah formalized what had been true in practice for years, married a woman named Abigail from Orofino in 1896, with Jeremiah and Catherine standing as witnesses and a leaner Stone serving as the youngest and most enthusiastic ring bearer the church had ever seen. The ceremony was followed by a celebration at the camp that lasted until 2 in the morning, and Pete played the fiddle for 2 hours before his best man, reasonably, took it away from him. The mountain changed with the decades but kept its fundamental character. The trees fell and were dragged and were milled and became the buildings and the bridges and the railroad ties of a growing country. And new trees grew behind them in the ways that new trees always do when the land is managed with patience rather than stripped in haste. Jeremiah had been ahead of his time on this, an instinct toward preservation that he could not have named in the vocabulary of a later era, but which expressed itself practically in the way he rotated his timber operations, leaving young growth undisturbed, planning his cuts with attention to what would regenerate and at what rate. In the early years of the new century, as the 20th century announced itself with the particular combination of technological optimism and human complexity that characterized its arrival, Jeremiah and Catherine Stone sat on the steps of the house on the eastern edge of the camp, expanded now to 4 rooms plus the loft, solid and warm and full of books and children's drawings, and the particular accumulated evidence of a life actively and well lived, and looked at their mountain. The Douglas firs were tall. The camp was quiet in the way camps are in the evening after a full day of work. The river could be heard below, no longer silent under ice but running fast with the spring runoff. Somewhere in the middle bunkhouse, Pete Callahan's fiddle was playing, as it had played on the Friday evenings of their whole lives together. 43, Jeremiah said. What? Catherine said. I'm 43 years old, he said, and I have never been afraid of anything in my life until I walked into that bunkhouse in the dark in November of 1887 and asked you whether any of it had been real. She looked at him. Why didn't you say so? I thought it was fairly visible, he said. I thought you were angry, she said. I was angry, he said. I was also terrified. The 2 things are not mutually exclusive. She laughed and reached up and put her hand on his jaw, and he turned his face into her hand in the way he had for 15 years, the same reflexive gravitational movement, as natural as trees growing toward light. It was all real, she said. You know that. I know it, he said. I've known it since that morning on the ridge. Since I kissed you first, she said. Since you kissed me first, he agreed, with the small, private smile that was the rarest and most valuable thing she had ever extracted from the world. Eleanor appeared at the door behind them with James, who was 8 and reading by lamplight past his bedtime as he always was when no one was watching closely, and announced that Alvar, who was still cooking at 71, stubbornly and superbly, had sent a plate of something for them, and would they come in because it was getting cold. Jeremiah stood and offered Catherine his hand, and she took it and they went inside, into the warmth and the light, into the sounds of their children and their household and their life. And the door closed against the mountain evening, and the fiddle kept playing in the yard, and the Douglas firs stood tall in the dark, indifferent as they had always been to the small and enormous human drama that had played out in their shadow. And the river moved at the bottom of the valley, carrying everything it carried, going where it always went, constant and cold and free. He had been, by the account of every man who ever worked beside him, the strongest man on Elk Ridge. He could fell a tree faster than any two men combined, and carry a load that made experienced loggers stop and reconsider their assumptions about human capacity. He had built an empire from $300 and a promise made at a grave, and he had held it against theft and deception, and the relentless pressure of bigger men with more capital, and he had never bent. But the strength that the men who knew him well remembered, the strength that Pete Callahan described in later years when he told the story to his own children, was the strength it had taken to walk out to the tree line when he was hurt and to come back in the dark and sit down and ask the question. To admit to himself and then to her that something had changed, that the evenings at the cook shack table had mattered, that the mornings on the ridge had mattered, that she had mattered in a way that was not manageable from a safe distance, in a way that required him to be actually vulnerable for perhaps the first time in his life. That was the strength that had built the real thing, not the timber empire, which was real and significant and a genuine achievement, but the life that contained it. The life with the woman who had ridden up a mountain with a secret in her lining and an unfinished grief in her heart, and had not flinched when an axe landed between her feet, who had told him the truth at the full cost of telling it, who had kissed him first on a promontory in the snow because she had decided to stop standing at the edge of things and move toward them. She had made him feel it, every part of it. The weight of what had been built, the possibility of what could be lost, the reality of what was worth keeping. She had arrived on that supply wagon like a new feature in familiar terrain, and she had changed everything in the way that he had, in those first minutes, correctly predicted she would. He had never, for a single day in all the years that followed, wished it otherwise. The fiddle played on. The mountain stood in the dark. The door was warm and the light was on, and Catherine Townsend Stone was inside, which was where she had been and where she would be and where everything that mattered lived.